Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Usually when we look back into Formula One's history, we look back at memorable races and memorable moments, but we're going to be doing something a bit different today. We're instead going to be looking back at a race that often gets mentioned as one of the most boring in Formula One history, and that's the 1999 Spanish Grand Prix. Now, you may ask why I look back at a boring race, and that's probably a valid question. However, we're really not going to be looking as much back at the race itself, and instead the reaction to the race, as I think there was a lot of interesting reactions from fans as well as those within the sport. Before getting further into it though, if you enjoy the video then please give it a like and share the video, and if you want to see more similar content then you can subscribe to the channel. The Spanish Grand Prix was round 5 of the 1999 season, and heading into the weekend, Michael Schumacher had an 8-point lead in the championship over his teammate Eddie Irvine, while McLaren driver Mika Hakkinen was third, 12 points behind Schumacher. Despite being behind in the championship, it appeared that McLaren had the quicker car, as Hakkinen had taken pole for all 4 of the season's races, but the McLaren was having difficulty finishing races and were hoping to turn that around in Spain. While qualifying ended up with a familiar result at the top, there were a few drivers in interesting places behind. Early in the session, Jean Alesi put his Sauber in provisional pole, and a bit later on when the main contenders came out to take their first runs, it was assumed that they would beat Alesi's time. Surprisingly, they did not though, and for the first half of the session, Alesi remained on top of the table. With 25 minutes to go, Alesi's time finally got beaten by Michael Schumacher, but even so he just barely managed to beat it by a few thousandths of a second, while shortly after that Coulthard nearly topped Schumacher. Another surprise came with Eddie Irvine topping his teammate Schumacher, while in the end Hakkinen put in a lap to take his 5th straight pole to start the year. With Irvine starting second, it was just the 4th time during the years as teammates that he outqualified Schumacher, while a lot of the talk was about Alesi's terrific lap which placed him in 5th. The lap he set early in the session remained his best lap, which many put down to it being done under cooler track conditions, but towards the end of the session Alesi put in another lap that was only about a 10th slower that would have put him 5th on the grid regardless, showing that it was no fluke. His fastest lap was so good though, that he ended up less than 2/10ths off of a front row start, and Alesi said that it was one of his best qualifying laps for at least 5 years. It was also just the 9th time a Sauber qualified in the top 5 since the team debuted in 1993. While Saturday created some positive and interesting headlines, Sunday would not. Hakkinen got off to a brilliant start, easily holding the lead into the first turn, while Coulthard outdragged both Ferraris into the first corner. The big surprise was Jacques Villeneuve in the BAR, who started 6th, but swooped around the outside of both Ferraris into the first turn to move up into 3rd. Schumacher, who was 4th, had a look on the inside of Villeneuve into turn 5, briefly locking up his left front, but was not close enough to pull off the move. As the field came around to complete the first lap, the order was Hakkinen, Coulthard, Villeneuve, Michael Schumacher, and Irvine, and this is how it would stay for a while, as the Ferraris could not find a way by Villeneuve even though they were quicker. Because of the BAR in between the McLarens and Ferraris, it allowed Hakkinen and Coulthard to open up a comfortable lead over their main rivals, gaining over a second a lap. On lap 22, Hakkinen held a 7-second lead over Coulthard, while Villeneuve was 27 seconds behind with both Ferraris right behind him. Irvine became the first of the front runners to pit that lap, though hoping to find some clean air, but instead came out right behind the Stewart of Rubens Barrichello down in 10th. Fortunately for Irvine, he was able to find a way by Barrichello in a move that was missed by the TV cameras for one of the rare on-track overtakes of the day. Hakkinen pitted the next lap, easily retaining his lead over everyone except Coulthard, and the lap after that both Villeneuve and Schumacher pitted. Ideally, Ferrari would have been able to pit Schumacher slightly earlier, hoping to jump Villeneuve, but that wasn't possible as it would have dropped him in the middle of the midfield, and since he couldn't pass Villeneuve on track, he was hoping to do it in the pits. That's exactly what happened, as Schumacher streaked away while Villeneuve was still in his pit box, and even better for Ferrari, Irvine jumped Villeneuve as well. Coulthard then was the final frontrunner to make his first stop a few laps later, but slightly overshot his pit box, costing him about 5 extra seconds in his pit stop, but fortunately for him, he still had a large enough gap to rejoin in second place. With clean air now, Schumacher became the fastest driver on track, gaining about a second a lap on Hakkinen and at times 2 seconds a lap on Villeneuve, who was previously holding him up, but he still had a lot of time to gain. After 42 laps of the 65-lap race, Schumacher had halved his gap to Hakkinen to just under 15 seconds, and he was now less than a second behind Coulthard, so Coulthard was legitimately under threat as they headed towards the second pit stop sequence. Schumacher came in for his final stop on the next lap, and while he had a good stop, he was held up on pit entry by the arrows of Toru Takagi, who was pitting as well. He came out on a clear track, though, so he had a chance to go as fast as he could to jump Coulthard. Hakkinen pitted the next lap, easily staying ahead of Schumacher, while Coulthard gave it everything he had to stay ahead of Schumacher and pitted the lap after Hakkinen. Coulthard had a clear pit entry, so gained time there, and had to stop 3/10 quicker than Schumacher and was able to come out just in front of the Ferrari. Schumacher lost out on his best chance to pass Coulthard and dropped off slightly as the stint went on, but did gain briefly as Coulthard was having trouble getting through the lap cars of Jarno Trulli, Rubens Barrichello, and Damon Hill, battling for the final points-paying position. When Schumacher went down the inside of Barrichello into turn 4, Hill used it as an opportunity to put a nice move on Barrichello around the outside of turn 5. While the move was partly seen on camera, the camera's focus was mainly on Schumacher, who was now on his own. As for Schumacher, though, he wasn't able to use the traffic to get by Coulthard. Eventually, Hakkinen came around to take the win, leading a McLaren 1-2 over Coulthard, while Schumacher took the final podium position about 4.5 seconds behind Coulthard. Irvine would take 4th, Ralf Schumacher 5th, and Trulli 6th. Meanwhile, Villeneuve, who had an excellent opening stint, ended up retiring after troubles with his rear wing and gearbox, while Alesi couldn't translate his brilliant qualifying to a result on Sunday, retiring with transmission failure. This ended what was a bit of an underwhelming race in terms of excitement, but the reaction to the race would still go on for a bit. On the post-race show on ITV, which broadcast Formula 1 at the time, there wasn't really any talk about the race not being exciting, and they instead discussed how the McLaren 1-2 was good for the title fight for the rest of the year. None of the interviews shown with any of the drivers or team members mentioned the race being boring either. However, when going through the drivers' post-race quotes, there is one from Irvine which stands out, in which he said, "I don't think we should have so much testing at the same track the week before a Grand Prix, as it always seems to make for a dull race. I wish I had my stereo in my car to keep me amused." In the following week's edition of Autosport magazine, the cover said F1 under attack. Stars call for rules revamp after critics slam race. A further headline a few pages in was Top Name Slam Boring F1. Inside, there was a poll from Radio Autosport that asked whether the race was exciting or boring, and of the results that came back, only 1.25% stated they thought the race was exciting, while the other 98.75% said boring. I'm not sure of the sample size of this poll, and while having only the choices exciting and boring could skew the answers one way or the other over something like ranking the race from 1 to 10, the results are still overwhelming and show that the fans didn't enjoy the race. Of the drivers to initially come out and make statements against the then current Formula 1 regulations, the three most vocal were David Coulthard, Michael Schumacher, and Damon Hill. The main ideas they said needed to be changed were going back to the wide slick tires instead of the more narrow groove tires introduced in 1998, widening the cars closer to what they were in 1997 opposed to the more narrow width they were regulated to in 1998, and to make the cars less aero-dependent. They all seemed to agree that not only did the current cars not produce good racing, but they were also not fun to drive. Hill summed up everything he thought by saying, "We need to enable the cars to race. It is motor racing after all." Williams technical director Patrick Head was also in agreement with the drivers, stating that the races need to be more entertaining, and offered an initial suggestion. Head said Grand Prix racing must be an entertainment, but without any suspicion that it's been fixed or allowed to develop into a farce. You only have to look at NASCAR racing in America to see the potential that it has. The problem facing anybody who has to provide an entertainment like F1 is that most viewers now have a choice of as many as 50 channels, and if those viewers are not purists, they will cruise on to the next channel as soon as the motor racing ceases to be entertaining. It is possible to classify each circuit into one of 3 or 4 categories defined by the technical people, for which there will be limitations on the size and shape of the rear wing. It could certainly be done if there were enough tenacity required to make the definition and enforce it. Had also added that the current tires were no good, and said that it must be depressing for Bridgestone to have to make lousy tires. Even Bernie Ecclestone was in agreement that the racing needed to be better, saying, "I have never been one for making big changes to the tires. The theory has been that we need to slow the cars down in the corners for safety's sake. It has always been Max's ambition to do that with the tires, but I don't know why myself. His idea is that an accident at 200 miles per hour is more dangerous than one at 160 miles per hour, but people can get killed at 40 miles per hour. We must go back to wide slick tires to get more grippy and more overtaking. I want to see them getting right under the back wing of the car in front and then running wide to get past. The aerodynamics now are just so good that it doesn't happen very much anymore, and we have to do something about it." Autosport ran a roundtable with some key figures in Formula One a week after the race, including Hill and Coulthard, along with Murray Walker, Alan Jenkins, Nigel Roebuck, and Max Mosley, asking various questions about the current state of Formula One. For the most part, there is agreement that something should be done with the regulations to make overtaking easier, and that overtaking was getting harder than it was in the previous years. A suggestion put to them was whether refueling should be banned, and there was a split among the panel, with Coulthard saying it would bring a different strategic element, as you would have to decide if you should set your car up for the beginning or end of the race, while Hill said that he thought that refueling was a spectacle as well. Further radical suggestions were put forth as well, such as overtaking lanes and corners, random elements in qualifying to mix up the grid, and whether wings should just be banned altogether, but everyone seemed to be in agreement that these would be going too far. It was here, though, that Hill suggested that the teams test too much, and that reducing the amount of testing could naturally produce a bit of a random factor and give the small teams a chance. While most were in agreement that changes should be made, the one person who seemed to think that everything wasn't as bad as everyone was making it was FIA President Max Mosley, and he wasn't really interested about what the drivers had to say about it. Mosley said, "The general feeling is that as long as the cars are safe, we are not concerned whether the driver liked the cars or not. Because they are paid so much, they are not entitled to like or dislike them. It is not up to the drivers to decide on the regulations. They naturally want cars which are easy to drive and easy to overtake in, but that might not be the best principle of Formula One. The question we have to face is whether it is just too difficult to overtake. The fact is that this season, we have had 4 fascinating races and one which clearly was not so interesting, but that is no reason to panic." He also insisted that the grooved tires were the direction Formula One should be going, and they were an effective way of slowing the cars down. Also in the roundtable with Autosport, Mosley stated that overtaking should be difficult, and expanded that he thought that the difficulty of overtaking made things better in some ways. He said, "It's harder to overtake now than it was 30 years ago when you had lots of slipstreaming. At Monza in 1971, there were more than 100 overtaking maneuvers, and it was completely boring unless you were deeply involved, because everything was academic into the last corner of the last lap. Now there is the fascination of seeing the race developing, and whether there is a chance for a driver to pass another in the pit stop. In the old-fashioned way, if one car caught another, you knew that he would get by in a lap or two. Now if he catches him, you can't go out and make a cup of tea because that might be the moment when he does overtake." Mosley did admit, though, that the Spanish Grand Prix was boring, and that he was in agreement with the drivers about reducing the amount of downforce on the cars, but his reasoning was more so it would slow the cars down more, as opposed to any effect it would have on the racing. Overall, while the race did bring a lot of discussion from all sides about what needed to be done in Formula One, there did seem to be some agreement from everyone within the sport that Formula One was not as bad as the one race, and I'd have to agree. Formula One, and really any other sport in general, is never really as good as its best moments, but at the same time not as bad as its worst. Forex lists this race as having 4 overtakes, which is one more than it lists for the earlier race at Imola that year, while the most during the year was 42 at France, and the most in a dry race in 1999 was 37 in Australia. Hungary from that year is also listed as having 3 overtakes on top of Imola, while the season finale at Suzuka is listed as having matched Spain with 4 overtakes. While Barcelona has never really been seen as a classic track and a difficult one to overtake on, The previous races at the circuit tended to see about 10 to 20 overtakes according to Forex, but the 2000 and 2002 races at the circuit had only 3 overtakes listed each. Now, the excitement in racing isn't only about overtaking and also includes things such as how strategy plays out throughout the race, but at the same time I agree that overtaking shouldn't feel impossible. Formula One has gone through spells like this in the past in which there were a few races that aren't exciting in a row, and it certainly does lead to criticism. Some of the races that took place at Valencia certainly had quite a bit of criticism, as well as the French Grand Prix in 2019, but normally shortly after a more exciting race happens, the amount of criticism tends to die off for a bit. This is what happened after the 1999 Spanish Grand Prix for the most part, as there were some interesting races that followed during the summer, including the French Grand Prix just 2 races after, and the championship battle between Hakkinen and Irvine added excitement as well. Occasionally, though, you get a race such as Abu Dhabi in 2010, when Fernando Alonso struggled to pass Vitaly Petrov, meaning he couldn't score enough points to win that year's championship, and the following year DRS was introduced. While criticisms tend to come and go over the years, I do find it interesting just how much attention this race got for being boring. The 1999 season started out with what I think was a really good race in Australia, and while the 3 races after weren't classics, I don't think the races in Brazil and San Marino were really that bad. Another reason this surprises me is that it took place in an age before we really had social media. The internet was still in its early days, and not everyone had access to it, so we weren't all connected to each other in the same way we can be today. There are certainly other cases of races or even seasons from before this leading to heavy criticism and discussion, but it's still rare for cases like this with seemingly everyone in agreement that change was needed. So that's all I have for this race. Let me know if you remember watching this race or if you followed Formula One in this time period. If so, did you think the reaction to the race was justified, and what, if any, changes do you think Formula One could or should have made at the time? Also, do you think this was the sport's most boring race, and if not, what race do you think is? Thanks for watching.